The wind howled through the broken windows of the downtown Chicago high-rise like a wounded animal, carrying snow and the stench of death in equal measure. Marcus Rodriguez pressed his back against the freezing concrete wall, his breath coming out in ragged clouds that hung in the air before disappearing into the darkness. 3 weeks ago, he'd been complaining about his commute to the accounting firm where he worked. Now he was trying to remember the last time he'd eaten something that wasn't scavenged from a ransacked convenience store. Funny how the world could flip upside down faster than you could blink. The shambling sounds below told him they were still down there, those things that used to be people, now just frozen corpses with an appetite that death couldn't kill. Marcus gripped the aluminum baseball bat tighter, the metal so cold it felt like it was burning through his gloves. He'd found it in a sporting goods store 4 days back, and it had already saved his neck twice. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd never played baseball in his life, always been more of a basketball guy, but here he was, acting like he was stepping up to home plate every time one of those dead freaks got too close. "You still breathing over there, or did you turn into a popsicle?" The voice came from across the room, and Marcus couldn't help but crack a smile despite everything. That was Donnie Patterson, always running his mouth even when keeping quiet might save their lives. The guy had been a stand-up comedian before the world went to hell, and he insisted on keeping his sense of humor intact even as everything else fell apart. "Barely," Marcus whispered back. "How's it looking on your side?" "Like a frozen nightmare wrapped in a crap sandwich," Donnie replied, his silhouette visible against the faint gray light coming through the window. "I count maybe 15 of them down on Michigan Avenue, all doing that weird shuffle thing. It's like watching the world's worst flash mob, man. Nobody's got rhythm anymore." Marcus crawled over to where Donnie was crouched, careful not to make any noise that might carry down to street level. The comedian wasn't wrong. The undead below were moving like they were stuck in slow motion, the extreme cold having frozen their joints and muscles into something that moved even more awkwardly than usual. Some of them were literally frozen in place, their feet stuck to the icy pavement, but their heads still turned toward any sound or movement, jaws working silently in the sub-zero air. "We need to move before nightfall," Marcus said, checking his watch. The battery was dying, but it still worked well enough to tell him they had maybe 2 hours of daylight left. "That shelter Beth was talking about, the one over in Wicker Park, that's our best shot." Donnie nodded, his usual jokey demeanor slipping for just a moment. "Yeah, well, Beth also said there might be actual living people there." Might being the operative word. For all we know, we're walking into another dead zone, or worse, running into those psychos who were setting up roadblocks last week. Marcus had been trying not to think about that. The zombies were one thing, predictable in their hunger and their single-minded pursuit of flesh. But the living? They were a whole different kind of danger. Desperation made people do things they never would have considered before, and 3 weeks without power, heat, or hope had turned some folks into monsters that didn't need to be undead to be terrifying. A sound from the stairwell made them both freeze. Not the dragging shuffle of the undead, but footsteps, quick and purposeful. Marcus raised his bat while Donnie pulled out a wickedly sharp kitchen knife he'd been carrying since they teamed up. They waited, barely breathing, as the steps got closer. Then a voice, young and scared, called out from the darkness. "Please, don't shoot or whatever. I'm alive, I'm human, and I really, really don't want to die today." A figure emerged from the stairwell, hands raised, and Marcus felt his grip on the bat relax slightly. It was a kid, couldn't have been more than 19 or 20, wearing a Northwestern University hoodie that had seen better days and a backpack that looked like it was stuffed full of supplies. Her red hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and her freckled face was streaked with dirt and what might have been dried blood. "Easy there, college," Donnie said, lowering his knife. "You trying to give us a heart attack? We got enough problems without you sneaking around like some kind of undead ninja." "Sorry," the girl said, lowering her hands slowly. "I saw you guys from the building across the street." Figured actual living people were worth the risk of checking out. I'm Riley. Riley Morrison. Marcus studied her for a moment, his accountant's brain automatically calculating risks and benefits. Another person meant another mouth to feed, but it also meant an extra pair of hands and eyes. Plus, she'd made it this far on her own, which meant she had to have some skills beyond just running and hiding. Marcus Rodriguez, he said, extending his hand. That's Donnie Patterson. You been alone this whole time? Riley shook his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. Not the whole time. I was with a group, maybe 8 of us, holed up in the student center. But then the power went out completely, and the cold got in, and people started making stupid decisions. Half of them wanted to head south, try to get out of the city. The other half wanted to stay put and wait for rescue. She paused, her eyes going distant. They left 4 days ago. I don't know what happened to them, but I heard a lot of screaming that night from the direction they headed. Jesus, Donnie muttered. That's rough, kid. Well, welcome to our merry little band of survivors. We were just planning our next stupid decision, so you picked a great time to join up. Marcus shot him a look but didn't disagree with the assessment. Every choice they made now was a gamble, a roll of the dice with their lives on the line. But staying put wasn't an option either. The building they were in had already been picked clean of anything useful, and the cold was only getting worse. The weather reports, back when there'd been anyone around to give weather reports, had said this was the worst winter storm in Chicago's history. Now, with no heat and no end in sight, the cold was as much of an enemy as the undead. We're heading to Wicker Park, Marcus explained. There's supposedly a shelter there, set up in an old warehouse. We heard about it from another survivor a few days back. Could be legit, could be a trap, could be nothing at all. But it's the best lead we've got. Riley's eyes lit up slightly. I heard about that too. Some people in my group mentioned it before things fell apart. They said it was being run by former military types, people who actually know what they're doing. She hesitated. But I also heard they're not exactly welcoming to just anyone. Supposed to have some kind of screening process, make sure you're not infected or crazy or whatever. Well, 2 out of 3 ain't bad, Donnie quipped, earning another look from Marcus. What? I'm just saying, the jury's still out on the crazy part for all of us. Marcus ignored him and moved back to the window, surveying the street below. The undead were still there, but they seemed more sluggish than before, the cold really doing a number on them. That was something, at least. When this whole nightmare had started, those things had been fast, aggressive, overwhelming in their numbers. But the cold had slowed them down, frozen them in place in some cases. It was the only reason Marcus and Donnie had survived this long. All right, here's the plan, Marcus said, his leadership skills from managing teams at work kicking in automatically. We head out in 15 minutes, gives us enough time to gather our stuff and make sure we've got everything we need. We stick to the alleys and side streets as much as possible, avoid any major roads where those things might be clustered up. It's about 3 miles to Wicker Park, and with the ice and snow, we're looking at maybe an hour and a half of travel time, probably more. And if we run into trouble? Riley asked, pulling her backpack around and unzipping it. Marcus saw what looked like canned food, bottled water, and a small handgun nestled inside. Then we run, we hide, or we fight, in that order, Marcus said firmly. I'm not interested in being a hero. We're trying to survive, not win any medals. The dead can't get tired, but we can, and getting surrounded is a death sentence. They spent the next few minutes preparing, checking their supplies and bundling up as best they could against the brutal cold. Marcus had layered every piece of clothing he'd managed to scavenge, looking more like a walking laundry pile than a human being, but fashion wasn't exactly a priority anymore. Donnie had found a thick winter coat in one of the abandoned apartments, and Riley seemed pretty well set with her northwestern gear and a heavy parka. As they prepared to leave, Marcus took one last look around the office space that had been their shelter for the past 2 nights. It wasn't much, just a frozen corporate wasteland full of cubicles and motivational posters that seemed like cruel jokes now, but it had kept them safe. Moving meant risk, but staying meant slow death from cold and starvation. Some choice. They made their way down the stairwell carefully, Marcus in the lead with his bat ready, Riley in the middle with her gun drawn but pointed at the floor, and Donnie bringing up the rear with his knife. The building was silent except for the wind and the occasional creak of metal and concrete contracting in the cold. Every floor they passed showed signs of the chaos that had swept through when everything collapsed. Overturned desks, scattered papers, dark stains on the carpet that Marcus tried not to think too hard about. On the 3rd floor, they encountered their first real obstacle. One of those things was frozen in the hallway, literally encased in ice from the burst pipe above it. Its dead eyes tracked their movement, and its jaw worked soundlessly, but it couldn't move, couldn't reach them. Marcus almost felt sorry for it, trapped in its own body for what might be eternity, but then he remembered what those things did to the living and kept moving. The ground floor lobby was a disaster zone, all shattered glass and frozen puddles that made walking treacherous. Marcus could see the street beyond, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the abandoned cars and debris. He held up a hand, signaling the others to stop while he checked for movement. "Clear," he whispered after a tense minute. "But we move fast and quiet. Those things we saw from upstairs are just a few blocks over, and sound carries in this cold." They slipped out through a side entrance, the frigid air hitting them like a physical blow. Marcus gasped despite himself, the cold so intense it made his lungs ache. The thermometer he'd seen in the last building had read -15, and that was before accounting for wind chill. This wasn't just winter, this was the kind of cold that killed exposed skin in minutes and made every breath feel like inhaling knives. The street was a frozen hellscape of abandoned vehicles and drifted snow. Some of the cars still had their doors open, their former occupants having fled in panic when the dead started rising. Others were sealed tight, and Marcus tried not to look too closely at the shapes inside them, wrapped in frost and stillness. They picked their way through the obstacle course, heading west toward Wicker Park, their footsteps crunching in the snow despite their best efforts to move quietly. They'd made it maybe 2 blocks when Donnie grabbed Marcus's arm and pointed. Ahead of them, emerging from between 2 buildings, came a small group of the undead. 5 of them, moving in that characteristic shuffle, their frozen clothes crackling with each movement. One of them was missing an arm, the limb probably having frozen solid and snapped off. Another had most of its face gone, just a skull with bits of frozen flesh clinging to it. "Back up slowly," Marcus breathed, his heart hammering in his chest. "Don't run unless they charge." But the undead weren't charging. They'd spotted the living humans, and their heads turned in unison like some kind of horrible synchronized swimming routine, but their movements were so slow that Marcus and his group were able to back around a corner before the creatures got anywhere close. The cold was definitely affecting them, slowing their already limited motor functions to a crawl. "That was too close," Riley whispered, her gun trembling slightly in her hands. "I almost shot them." "Save your bullets," Marcus advised. "Gunshots will bring every dead thing within 6 blocks down on us. We only shoot if we absolutely have to." They altered their route, swinging north to avoid the cluster of undead, and found themselves in what had been a trendy shopping district. The boutique windows were smashed in, their contents long since looted or scattered by the wind. A frozen corpse lay in one of the doorways, and Marcus couldn't tell if it was one of the undead or just someone who'd succumbed to the cold. Either way, it didn't move as they passed, and that was good enough for him. The sun was getting lower now, the shadows growing longer and the temperature, impossibly, seeming to drop even further. Marcus knew they needed to find shelter soon, or at least a place to rest. Pushing through the snow drifts and the bone-chilling cold was exhausting work, and he could see that both Donnie and Riley were starting to flag. "There," Donnie said, pointing to what looked like an old diner on the corner. "Let's check it out," maybe catch our breath for a few minutes. Marcus was about to argue that they needed to keep moving when he saw the look on Riley's face. The kid was tough, but she was also running on fumes, her lips taking on a bluish tint that spoke of the cold really getting to her. Against his better judgment, he nodded. The diner's door was unlocked, swinging open with a creak that sounded like a gunshot in the frozen silence. Inside was dark and cold, but at least it was out of the wind. Booths lined one wall, their red vinyl seats cracked and faded. The counter still had plates on it, the food long since frozen solid and covered in frost. It was like walking into a snapshot of the world before, preserved in ice and death. 5 minutes, Marcus said firmly. We rest for 5 minutes, then we keep moving. It'll be dark in less than an hour. They collapsed into one of the booths, the vinyl creaking under their weight. For a moment, nobody spoke, all of them just trying to catch their breath and warm up as much as possible in the freezing interior. Marcus could feel exhaustion tugging at him, the constant stress and fear wearing him down more than the physical exertion. You know what I miss most? Donnie said suddenly, breaking the silence. Hot coffee. Not even good coffee, just any coffee that wasn't frozen solid. I used to complain about the burnt crap they served at the club where I performed. Would kill for a cup of that garbage right now. Riley managed a small smile. I miss my roommate's terrible cooking. She'd make these disgusting veggie casseroles that looked like something died in a pot, but they were hot and filling, and she'd always make enough for both of us even when money was tight. Marcus thought about his own losses, the life he'd had before all this. I miss boring, he said quietly. I miss complaining about traffic and bad weather and my boss being a jerk. I miss problems that didn't involve whether I'd survive until tomorrow. Deep thoughts from our fearless leader, Donnie said, but there was no mockery in his voice, just understanding. Yeah, man. I hear you. Boring sounds pretty good right about now. The moment of reflection was shattered by a sound from the back of the diner. A crash, like something falling over, followed by a low moan that made Marcus's blood run cold. All three of them were on their feet instantly, weapons ready, eyes straining to see into the darkness of the kitchen area. Could be the wind, Riley whispered hopefully, but her gun was up and tracking toward the sound. Could be, Marcus agreed, not believing it for a second. Or we could have company. Stay sharp. The moan came again, definitely not the wind, and then a figure lurched out of the kitchen doorway. It had been a man once, wearing a cook's apron that was stained with things Marcus didn't want to identify. One of the undead, but this one seemed different. It wasn't frozen and slow like the others they'd encountered. It must have been inside, sheltered from the worst of the cold, and it moved with the horrifying speed that Marcus remembered from the early days of the outbreak. Run, he shouted, and they bolted for the door. The dead cook came after them with surprising quickness, knocking over chairs and sending plates crashing to the floor in its pursuit. Marcus hit the door first, yanking it open and nearly slipping on the ice outside. Donnie was right behind him, and Riley brought up the rear, turning as she reached the threshold and firing 3 quick shots. The sound was deafening in the frozen air, and Marcus's heart sank even as he saw the dead cook drop, Riley's bullets having found their mark. But the damage was done. The gunshots echoed through the empty streets like a dinner bell, and from all around them came answering moans and the shuffle of frozen feet. Oh man, that's bad, Donnie panted, his eyes wide as shapes began emerging from buildings and alleys all around them. That's really, really bad. Marcus's mind raced, assessing their options in the split second they had before being surrounded. The undead were coming from the east and south, drawn by the gunshots, but the way west and north still looked relatively clear. It wasn't the direct route to Wicker Park, but it was better than being torn apart. This way, he yelled, taking off at a run toward the north, his feet slipping and sliding on the ice. He could hear the others behind him, Riley gasping out apologies between ragged breaths, Donnie cursing in a continuous stream that would have been funny under any other circumstances. They ran through the frozen streets, the undead pursuing but unable to match their pace thanks to the cold that had locked up their joints. But there were so many of them, emerging from every building and car, drawn by the promise of living flesh. Marcus's lungs burned with the cold air, and his legs felt like lead, but he pushed on, knowing that stopping meant death. They rounded a corner and almost ran headlong into another group of zombies, these ones clustered around what looked like the remains of someone who hadn't made it. Marcus swung his bat without thinking, the impact jarring his arms as he connected with a frozen skull. The undead thing went down, but two more took its place, and suddenly they were fighting for their lives in the middle of the frozen street. Riley was firing her gun again, each shot carefully placed despite her obvious fear. Donnie was stabbing with his kitchen knife, keeping the grasping hands away from his face and neck. Marcus swung his bat like his life depended on it, because it absolutely did, breaking frozen limbs and caving in skulls with sickening crunches. "Through there!" Riley shouted, pointing to a narrow alley between two buildings. It was barely wide enough for them to squeeze through single file, but it was better than being surrounded in the open. They fought their way to the alley, Marcus taking the rear now, his bat keeping the pursuing undead at bay while Donnie and Riley slipped into the narrow passage. He backed in after them, the walls of the alley so close he could touch both sides with his arms outstretched. The undead tried to follow, but their frozen bodies and lack of coordination made it almost impossible for them to navigate the tight space. The three of them stumbled out the other end of the alley and found themselves in what looked like a residential area. Brownstone apartments lined the street, their windows dark and empty. The sun was touching the horizon now, painting the frozen city in shades of orange and red that would have been beautiful if it wasn't also signaling the coming of night. "We need shelter," Marcus gasped, his breath coming in painful heaves. "Can't be out here after dark." Not with all of them stirred up. There, Donnie pointed to one of the brownstones, its front door slightly ajar. "Worth a shot." They approached cautiously, weapons ready, but the building seemed quiet. Marcus pushed the door open fully and they slipped inside, closing it behind them and shoving a heavy coach rack in front of it as a makeshift barricade. The interior was cold, but it was at least out of the wind and away from the immediate danger of the undead. They were in a narrow hallway with stairs leading up to the second floor. Apartment doors lined both sides, all of them closed. Marcus tried the nearest one and found it locked, but the second door swung open to reveal a small studio apartment that looked like it had been left in a hurry. Clothes were scattered on the floor, and the bed was unmade, but there were no signs of struggle or death. "This'll work," Marcus decided, ushering the others inside and closing the door. "We'll hole up here for the night, leave at first light. It's too dangerous to keep moving in the dark." Riley collapsed onto the bed, her gun still clutched in her hand. "I'm sorry," she said again, tears starting to stream down her face. "I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have shot that thing in the diner. I just panicked, and now we're all—" "Hey, stop," Donnie said, sitting down next to her and putting a hand on her shoulder. "You did what you had to do. That dead cook was gonna get us if you hadn't dropped him. Yeah, it brought the horde down on us, but we made it. We're alive. That's what counts." Marcus wanted to be angry, to blame Riley for putting them in danger, but he couldn't. The truth was, any one of them could have made the same mistake. Fear and adrenaline made people do things, and second-guessing every decision was a luxury they couldn't afford. He moved to the window and peered out through the frost-covered glass, his heart sinking at what he saw. The street below was filling up with the undead, dozens of them, maybe more, all drawn by the gunshots and the commotion of the chase. They wandered aimlessly in the fading light, bumping into cars and each other, their moans creating a horrible chorus that echoed through the frozen city. They were trapped, at least for the night. "We've got company," Marcus reported grimly. "Lots of it. We're not going anywhere until morning, and even then it's gonna be tricky." Donnie joined him at the window and let out a low whistle. "Man, that's a whole lot of angry dead people. On the bright side, at least they can't climb stairs, right? That's a thing? Please tell me that's a thing." It's a thing, Marcus confirmed, though he'd seen some of the undead manage surprising feats when motivated by the presence of living humans. As long as we're quiet and don't draw attention, we should be okay until sunrise. They settled in as best they could, taking turns keeping watch while the others tried to rest. Marcus took the first shift, sitting by the window with his bat across his knees, watching the nightmare parade below. His mind wandered to the shelter they were trying to reach, wondering if it was even real or just another false hope in a world that seemed determined to crush any optimism. He thought about the people he'd lost in the first days of the outbreak. His sister, who'd lived across town and who he'd never been able to reach. His co-workers, most of whom he'd watched get torn apart when the dead had swarmed their office building. His best friend from college, who'd sent one last text message saying he was infected and not to come looking for him. The weight of all that loss sat on Marcus's chest like a physical thing, making it hard to breathe. "Can't sleep?" Riley's voice pulled him from his dark thoughts. She'd gotten up from the bed and was moving quietly across the room to join him at the window. "Somebody's gotta keep watch," Marcus replied. "You should rest while you can." "Can't," she admitted, wrapping her arms around herself. "Every time I close my eyes, I see them. The people I lost, the ones who turned, the ones who didn't make it. It's like a movie that won't stop playing in my head." Marcus nodded, understanding completely. "Yeah. I know what you mean. Sometimes I wonder if the lucky ones were the ones who went first, before they had time to really understand what was happening." "That's dark, man," Riley said, but there was no judgment in her voice. "But I get it. This whole situation is beyond dark. It's like we're living in some kind of nightmare that we can't wake up from." They sat in silence for a while, watching the undead mill about below. Then Riley spoke again, her voice soft. "Do you think the shelter is real? The one in Wicker Park?" "I don't know," Marcus answered honestly. "But it's something to hope for, and right now, hope is in pretty short supply. Even if it's not what we're expecting, it's gotta be better than just wandering around waiting to freeze or get eaten." "Fair point," Riley conceded. She was quiet for another moment, then asked, "What did you do? Before all this, I mean." "I was an accountant," Marcus said, and almost laughed at how absurd it sounded now. "Spent my days crunching numbers and making sure people's taxes were filed correctly. Boring as hell, but it paid the bills." "You?" "Pre-med," Riley said. "Was gonna be a doctor, save lives, make a difference. Funny how that worked out. Now I'm just trying to stay alive long enough to see tomorrow." "You're still saving lives," Marcus pointed out. "Those shots you took saved all of us from that cook. And who knows, maybe wherever we end up, they'll need someone with medical training. Every skill matters now." Riley smiled, the first genuine smile Marcus had seen from her. "Thanks. I needed to hear that." Donnie stirred on the bed, mumbling something in his sleep about bad hecklers and frozen pizzas. Despite everything, Marcus found himself smiling. Here they were, three strangers thrown together by circumstance, huddled in a freezing apartment while the undead prowled outside, and somehow they were making it work. Maybe that was what survival looked like in this new world. Not grand heroics or military precision, just people doing their best to look out for each other and make it one more day. The night crawled by with agonizing slowness. They rotated watch shifts every 2 hours, each of them taking their turns staring out into the frozen darkness and listening to the moans of the dead. The temperature inside the apartment dropped steadily, and they huddled together for warmth, sharing what blankets they could find and trying not to think about how cold it would get before sunrise. Around what Marcus guessed was 3 in the morning, something changed. The undead below, which had been wandering aimlessly, suddenly all turned in the same direction, their heads cocking as if listening to something. Then, as one, they began moving east, shuffling off down the street with renewed purpose. "What the hell?" Donnie whispered, joining Marcus at the window. "Where are they going?" "I don't know," Marcus admitted, watching the strange exodus with a mixture of relief and concern. "Something's drawn their attention. Sound, maybe, or movement. Whatever it is, it's pulling them away from us." Within 10 minutes, the street below was nearly empty, just a few stragglers left behind. It was the first piece of luck they'd had all day, and Marcus wasn't about to question it. He woke Riley and explained the situation. "We should move now," he said. "While we've got the chance. It's still a few hours until dawn, but the streets are clear, and who knows how long that'll last." The others agreed, and they quickly gathered their belongings, checking their weapons and preparing to venture back out into the frozen hell. Marcus felt a knot of anxiety in his stomach, knowing that moving at night was risky, but the opportunity was too good to pass up. They slipped out of the apartment and back onto the street, the cold hitting them like a hammer. The moon was up, nearly full, reflecting off the snow and ice and providing enough light to navigate by. The silence was eerie after hours of listening to the moans of the undead, broken only by the wind and the crunch of their footsteps. They made good time through the empty streets, heading west toward Wicker Park. Every shadow made Marcus's heart jump, every sound of shifting ice or settling buildings sent adrenaline spiking through his system. But they encountered no undead, no other survivors, nothing but the frozen wasteland of the city. After about 45 minutes of careful movement, Donnie suddenly stopped and pointed ahead. "You guys see that?" Marcus looked and saw what had caught his attention. Light. Actual electric light, glowing from the windows of a large building several blocks ahead. In a city that had been dark for weeks, it was like seeing the sun itself. "That's gotta be it," Riley breathed, hope clear in her voice. "The shelter. It's real." They approached cautiously, years of horror movies making Marcus wary of anything that seemed too good to be true. But as they got closer, he could see that the building was indeed fortified, with makeshift walls and barriers set up around its perimeter. Figures moved behind the walls, and Marcus could see they were armed, keeping watch. "Stop right there," a voice called out when they got within 50 yards. A spotlight suddenly blazed to life, pinning them in its beam. "Identify yourselves." Marcus raised his hands, squinting against the light. "We're survivors. 3 of us. We heard there was shelter here." There was a pause, then the sound of a gate opening. A figure emerged, backlit by the light, carrying what looked like a rifle. As they approached, Marcus could make out more details. The person was a woman, maybe in her 40s, with short gray hair and the bearing of someone who'd seen combat. "Names," she demanded, her rifle not quite pointing at them but not exactly pointing away either. "Marcus Rodriguez, Donnie Patterson, Riley Morrison," Marcus replied, keeping his hands visible. "We've been surviving in the loop, trying to make our way here. We're not infected, we're not looking for trouble, we just need somewhere safe." The woman studied them for a long moment, her eyes sharp and assessing. Then she lowered her rifle slightly and nodded. "I'm Lieutenant Commander Janet Hughes, formerly of the Coast Guard. We've got shelter here, heat, food, and clean water. But we've got rules, and if you break them, you're out on your ass faster than you can blink. Understood?" "Understood," Marcus said, relief flooding through him. "Whatever the rules are, we'll follow them." Hughes gestured for them to follow her through the gate, and Marcus, Donnie, and Riley exchanged glances before complying. The compound beyond was impressive, clearly set up by people who knew what they were doing. There were multiple buildings connected by covered walkways, generators humming in the background providing the precious electricity, and people, actual living people, moving about with purpose. They were led to a processing area where a man in medical scrubs checked them over for bites and infections. He was thorough but efficient, and he seemed satisfied that none of them were compromised. A woman with a clipboard took down their information, what skills they had, what supplies they'd brought, any medical conditions they might have. "You'll be on probation for 2 weeks," Hughes explained as they were led to what would be their quarters. "That's standard for all new arrivals. You work, you contribute, you prove you're not gonna be a problem. After 2 weeks, if you're still here and you've pulled your weight, you become full members of the community. We've got about 200 people here now, all working together to survive." She showed them to a large room that had been set up as communal sleeping quarters, with rows of cots and blankets. It wasn't fancy, but it was warm, actually warm, and Marcus could have cried at the feeling of heat on his face. "Get some rest," Hughes said. "Tomorrow you'll be assigned work details. We'll talk more then about what your roles here will be." As she left, Marcus sank onto one of the cots, his body suddenly feeling every ache and pain from the day's ordeal. Donnie collapsed on the cot next to him, already half asleep, while Riley took the one on his other side. "We made it," Riley whispered, her voice full of wonder. "We actually made it." "Yeah," Marcus agreed, closing his eyes and letting himself relax for the first time in what felt like forever. "We made it." But even as exhaustion pulled him towards sleep, part of his mind remained alert, cautious. They were safe for now, in this moment, but the world outside was still frozen and full of death. The shelter was a refuge, but it wasn't a cure. The zombies were still out there, the cold was still killing, and who knew how long any of this would last. Still, for tonight, they had heat and safety and the presence of other living humans. In a world that had taken so much, that was more than enough. Marcus let himself drift off, the sound of breathing around him a reminder that they weren't alone anymore, that somehow, against all odds, they'd found hope in the frozen wasteland. The next morning came with the sound of activity throughout the compound. Marcus woke to find the communal quarters busy with people getting ready for the day, some heading out for work details while others came in from night shifts. The atmosphere was one of organized purpose, everyone knowing their role and doing their part. Hughes found them at breakfast, which consisted of hot oatmeal and what passed for coffee these days. It wasn't gourmet, but it was hot and filling, and Marcus savored every bite. "Rodriguez," Hughes said, taking a seat across from him. "Your background in accounting, that's gonna be useful. We've got supplies to track, rationing to manage, all the logistics that keep this place running. Patterson, we need people to help keep morale up. Entertainment duty. Morrison, we're short on anyone with medical training. You'll be working with Doc Miller in the infirmary." She paused, her expression becoming more serious. "I'm not gonna lie to you. This setup we've got here, it's fragile. The generators run on fuel we're scavenging from around the city. The food we've stockpiled will only last so long. We're doing our best to make contact with other survivor groups, maybe coordinate with whatever's left of the government or military, but so far we're on our own." "What about the cold?" Donnie asked. "And the zombies? They seemed pretty active last night." "The cold is keeping the dead slower than they'd otherwise be," Hughes explained. "But it's also killing us. We lose people every week, either to the cold during scavenging runs or to those things when they get unlucky. And the weather reports we're getting from our ham radio operators suggest this freeze isn't letting up anytime soon." Marcus processed this information, his accountant's brain already working on the problem. "So we're in a race against time. Figure out a way to sustain ourselves or find a way out before resources run out." "Exactly," Hughes confirmed. "Which is why every person here matters. Every skill, every pair of hands. You three made it through the frozen hell out there to get here, which means you've got what it takes to survive. Now we need you to help everyone else do the same." Over the next few days, Marcus, Donnie, and Riley settled into their roles within the shelter community. Marcus found himself working with a woman named Patricia Chin who'd been a supply chain manager before the outbreak. Together they created detailed inventories of everything the shelter had, from food and medicine to weapons and fuel. The numbers weren't encouraging, but at least they knew what they were working with. Donnie took to his entertainment role with gusto, organizing movie nights using a projector and a collection of DVDs someone had brought, and even doing stand-up comedy sets that had people laughing despite the dire circumstances. His ability to find humor in the darkness became a valuable commodity, keeping spirits up when the reality of their situation threatened to crush morale. Riley threw herself into medical work, learning everything she could from Doc Miller, an elderly physician who'd come out of retirement when the world ended. She proved to be a natural, her pre-med training giving her a foundation that she built on rapidly. Within a week, she was helping with everything from treating frostbite to setting broken bones. But despite the relative safety and structure of the shelter, the world outside remained a constant threat. Scavenging parties went out every day, searching for fuel, food, medicine, and anything else that might be useful. Not all of them came back. Marcus heard the stories, whispered in quiet corners, about teams that got caught by hordes of the undead, or survivors who'd frozen to death when separated from their groups. On his 10th day at the shelter, Hughes approached Marcus with a request that made his stomach drop. "I need you to go out on a scavenging run," she said bluntly. "There's a warehouse about 2 miles from here that might have fuel and canned goods. We need someone with your organizational skills to assess what's there and coordinate the salvage." Marcus wanted to refuse, wanted to stay safe behind the walls where the undead couldn't reach him, but he knew he couldn't. Everyone contributed. That was the rule, the understanding that kept the shelter functioning. If people started refusing dangerous work, the whole system would collapse. "When do we leave?" he asked, proud that his voice stayed steady. "Tomorrow at dawn," Hughes replied. "You'll be with a team of 5 others, all experienced scavengers. Just follow their lead, do what they tell you, and you'll be fine." That night, Marcus lay awake on his cot, anxiety gnawing at him. Donnie and Riley both tried to reassure him, but they all knew the risks. The next morning came too quickly, and Marcus found himself gearing up with the scavenging team, checking weapons and supplies with hands that wanted to shake. The team leader was a man named Jake Stevens, a former firefighter with a calm competence that was somewhat reassuring. "Stick close, keep quiet, and if I say run, you run," he instructed Marcus. "Most of these missions go smooth. We get in, grab what we can, get out. The dead are slow in this cold. We'll be fine." They left through a side gate as the sun was just beginning to rise, moving out into the frozen city in a tight group. Marcus found himself in the middle of the formation, surrounded by people who'd done this dozens of times. The familiarity of their movements helped calm his nerves slightly. The warehouse was exactly where the maps said it would be, a squat concrete building surrounded by a chain-link fence. The gate had been broken open at some point, and there were signs of previous looting, but Jake seemed confident there was still worthwhile material inside. They approached cautiously, checking for undead, but the area seemed clear. Too clear, Marcus thought, his accountant's brain picking up on the anomaly. In a city full of zombies, empty spaces usually meant something had driven them away, and that something was rarely good news. Jake must have been thinking the same thing because he signaled for extra caution as they entered the warehouse through a loading dock door. Inside was dark, their flashlights cutting through the gloom to reveal rows of shelving stacked with crates and boxes. Jackpot, if the contents were what they hoped. Marcus moved to the nearest crate and pried it open, finding it full of canned vegetables. He nodded to Jake and began making notes, cataloging what they'd found while the others started loading supplies onto a cart they'd brought. The work went quickly and efficiently, and Marcus started to think maybe this wouldn't be so bad after all. Then they heard it. A sound from deeper in the warehouse, metal scraping on concrete. The team froze, weapons coming up, flashlights swinging toward the noise. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then figures emerged from the darkness, but they weren't the shambling dead. They were living people, 6 of them, armed with guns and knives and looking like they hadn't eaten well in weeks. The leader, a scarred man with wild eyes, smiled without warmth. Well, looks like Santa came early this year, boys. These folks have been nice enough to gather up all these supplies for us." Jake raised his hands slowly, his voice calm and measured. "Easy now. There's enough here for everyone. We don't want trouble." "Too bad," the scarred man replied. "Because trouble's what you got. Drop your weapons, all of you, or this gets messy real quick." Marcus's heart hammered in his chest as he weighed their options. The raiders outnumbered them and had better positions, better weapons. Fighting would likely get them all killed. But giving up their supplies meant the shelter would lose precious resources, and who knew what these people would do to them after they surrendered. The standoff stretched for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. Then, from outside, came the sound they'd all been dreading. Moans. Lots of them. The sounds of their confrontation had drawn the undead, and from the volume, it sounded like a lot of them. The scarred man's expression changed from predatory confidence to alarm. What the hell did you idiots do? Wasn't us, genius, Jake shot back. You're the ones who started yelling. Now we're all in it together. The warehouse doors shuddered as bodies pressed against them from outside. The moaning grew louder, more insistent. They were surrounded, raiders and scavengers alike, trapped in a building that was rapidly becoming a tomb. We need to work together, Marcus heard himself saying, his voice cutting through the rising panic. There's gotta be another way out of here, and we need to find it before those things break through. The scarred man looked at him, then at the shuddering doors, then back. Marcus could see the calculation happening behind those wild eyes, survival instinct warring with greed. Finally, he nodded. Fine. We team up, get out of here alive. Then we talk about the supplies. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than everyone dying in the next few minutes. The combined group moved deeper into the warehouse, searching for an exit while the undead hammered against the doors behind them. They found a fire exit, but it was frozen shut, the locking mechanism iced over and refusing to budge. Stand back, said one of Jake's team members, a woman named Sarah who'd been carrying a small hatchet. She swung it against the ice, chipping away at the frozen metal while the rest of them kept watch on the warehouse entrance. The doors were starting to splinter, dead hands reaching through the gaps. Hurry, someone shouted, and Sarah redoubled her efforts, sweat beading on her forehead despite the cold. Finally, with a crack, the ice gave way and the door swung open, revealing an alley filled with snow but, mercifully, no zombies. They piled through the exit just as the warehouse doors gave way completely, the undead flooding in like a grotesque tide. Marcus ran without looking back, his lungs burning with cold air, his legs pumping through the snow drifts. Behind him, he could hear the moans and the sounds of pursuit. The group split up instinctively, some going left, others right, all trying to lose the horde in the maze of alleys and streets. Marcus found himself running alongside Jake and two others, including one of the raiders, a younger guy who looked absolutely terrified. They ducked into a narrow passage between buildings, pressing themselves against the walls as the bulk of the undead shambled past, following other runners. When the immediate danger had passed, they carefully made their way back toward the shelter, taking a circuitous route to avoid any stragglers. They made it back in the early afternoon, exhausted and shaken but alive. The raider who'd ended up with them, a kid who couldn't have been more than 22 and introduced himself as Tommy, stared up at the shelter's walls with obvious awe. "You've really got something here," he said quietly. "All I've got is those psychos who'll probably kill me for not bringing back supplies." Jake and Marcus exchanged looks, and Marcus could see the other man thinking the same thing he was. "You helped us get out of there," Marcus said to Tommy. "Far as I'm concerned, that counts for something. You want to stay here, work with us instead of against us, I'll vouch for you." Tommy's eyes widened. "Seriously? Just like that?" "Just like that," Jake confirmed. "But you play straight with us. No games, no stealing, no betraying us to your old crew. Deal?" "Deal," Tommy agreed immediately, and Marcus could see genuine relief in his expression. Over the next few days, the shelter absorbed Tommy into their community, putting him to work and watching to make sure he was on the level. He proved to be a hard worker, grateful for the safety and structure after weeks of running with the raiders. His stories about the other survivors out there, the ones who'd turned to violence and predation, were sobering reminders that the undead weren't the only monsters they had to worry about. Marcus's 2-week probation ended, and he officially became a full member of the shelter community. So did Donnie and Riley, all three of them having proven their worth and commitment. They celebrated with a communal dinner, the closest thing to a party they could manage, and for a few hours, it almost felt normal. But normalcy was fleeting in the frozen wasteland Chicago had become. The cold showed no signs of letting up, and the undead remained a constant threat. Yet the shelter persevered, its people working together, looking out for each other, finding ways to survive one more day in a world that seemed determined to kill them all. Marcus stood watch one night, looking out over the frozen city from the shelter's walls, and thought about how far he'd come. From a terrified accountant hiding in an office building to a valued member of a survivor community, he'd adapted and grown in ways he never would have imagined. The world had ended, but somehow, impossibly, life went on. Donnie joined him on the wall, breath steaming in the frigid air. "Penny for your thoughts, fearless leader." Marcus smiled at the nickname that had stuck despite his protests. "Just thinking about everything that's happened. Everything we've lost and everything we've found." "Deep," Donnie said, but his tone was gentle, understanding. "We made it, though. Against all odds, we're still here, still fighting." "Yeah," Marcus agreed, his eyes scanning the frozen streets below where the undead still wandered in the endless winter. "We're still here. And for now, in this moment, that was enough. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, new struggles to survive. But tonight, they had warmth and safety and the company of other survivors. In the frozen streets and fading hope of a city taken over by cold and chaos, they'd found something precious, a reason to keep going, a community worth fighting for, and the strength to face whatever came next together.